Sweetheart, I think you're confused. This line is for executives only. These were the 10 words that detonated a woman's entire career. She thought she was putting someone in her place, a woman she'd already judged by the color of her skin. What she didn't know was that the woman she insulted wasn't just an executive. She was the one person on the planet her company couldn't afford to offend. What happens when the flight lands and a private Gulfstream jet parks next to the terminal, waiting for that same woman? You are about to witness a masterclass in karma that dismantles a life in 48 hours, all because of one single venomous sentence. Stick with me. The air in LaGuardia's Terminal B was a familiar symphony of chaos, a low hum of rolling luggage wheels against polished linoleum, the distant garbled announcements of gate changes, and the anxious chatter of travelers. It was a place of forced intimacy and unspoken hierarchies, and nowhere was that hierarchy more apparent than in the Sky Priority boarding lane for Delta One, the airline's premium cabin. The line was a neat, crimson-roped queue of people who looked expensive. They wore tailored suits, carried designer briefcases, and exuded an air of weary importance. Into this sea of navy blues and charcoal greys stepped Dr. Seraphina Vance. She was dressed in a simple, elegant ensemble of dark grey cashmere trousers and a cream-coloured silk blouse under a structured black blazer. Her hair was styled in intricate micro-locks, adorned with a few delicate gold cuffs that caught the light. She held a well-worn leather satchel, not a flashy designer bag, and on her face was a look of serene focus as she read something on her phone. She didn't push, she didn't demand attention. She simply found the end of the short line and stood waiting her turn. A few feet ahead of her, a woman named Carol Weatherby shifted her weight impatiently. Carol was the Senior Vice President of Market Strategy for Sterling Archer Holdings, a massive and notoriously aggressive private equity firm. She wore a power suit that was just a little too tight, her blonde hair sprayed into a rigid helmet. She was checking her watch, tapping a perfectly manicured nail against its face, and sighing with the theatricality of someone who believes their time is infinitely more valuable than anyone else's. Carol glanced back, her eyes scanning the line behind her, and her gaze landed on Seraphina. She took in Seraphina's appearance in a single, sweeping judgment. The locks, the understated clothing, the lack of a recognizable logo on her bag. Carol's lips tightened into a small, superior smirk. She leaned back slightly, not even bothering to lower her voice. "Excuse me," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Seraphina looked up from her phone, her calm expression unwavering. Yes, Carol gestured vaguely at the red carpet and the sign that read, Delta One, Sky Priority. "Sweetheart, I think you're confused. This line is for executives only. The main cabin boarding is over there." She pointed with a flick of her wrist toward the sprawling, chaotic general boarding area. The word sweetheart hung in the air, a verbal pat on the head, designed to infantilize and dismiss. The implication was clear, sharp, and ugly. You don't belong here. A brief silence fell over the small queue. A man in a Brioni suit shifted uncomfortably. A younger woman in a blazer looked down at her phone, suddenly fascinated by the screen. No one said a word. Seraphina didn't flush with anger. She didn't raise her voice. She simply held Carol's gaze, a flicker of something ancient and weary in her eyes. "I believe I'm in the correct line," she stated, her voice even and clear, a low-timbered contralto that carried an authority Carol's shrill tone could never achieve. Carol let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Oh, I'm sure you believe you are. But this is for first class, for status members. There's been a mistake." She looked toward the gate agent, expecting them to intervene and remove this person who was so clearly out of place in her world. The gate agent, a young man named Leo, was busy scanning a passport, but he'd heard the exchange. He looked over his eyes, meeting Seraphina's for a split second. He saw the quiet dignity in her posture and the arrogant entitlement in Carol's. Before Leo could speak, Seraphina said, still looking directly at Carol, "There is no mistake. She didn't offer to show her boarding pass. She didn't explain who she was or what she did. She refused to play the game of justifying her existence in a space she had every right to occupy. She simply stood her ground, her silence a more powerful rebuke than any shouted defense." Carol was incensed. This was not the reaction she expected. She had anticipated flustered apologies, a hasty retreat, a confirmation of her own superior status. Instead, she got nothing. Just calm, unshakable presence. It infuriated her. It felt like a challenge. "Look," Carol snapped her voice, now sharp and loud, drawing more attention. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but some of us have important business to get to. We're flying to the Global Innovators Symposium in Aspen. It's a serious event. You're holding up the line. The mention of the symposium was a deliberate power play, meant to intimidate. It was an exclusive, invitation-only gathering of the world's top venture capitalists, tech moguls and scientific pioneers." Seraphina's expression didn't change, but a new, almost imperceptible glint appeared in her eye. It was the look of a chess master who sees the entire board while their opponent is still fixated on a single pawn. "The symposium," Seraphina repeated softly, as if tasting the words. "Yes, I'm aware." Finally, it was Carol's turn at the podium. She slapped her passport and boarding pass down. "Carol Weatherby," she announced. Leo, the agent, scanned it with a practiced motion. "Enjoy your flight, Miss Weatherby." Carol shot a final, triumphant glare back at Seraphina. "Have a nice flight." In the back, she sneered under her breath, just loud enough for Seraphina to hear, before striding down the jet bridge with the air of a conqueror. A moment later, Seraphina stepped forward. She placed her phone down on the counter, the screen displaying her digital boarding pass. "Seat 2A, Delta 1. Leo scanned it. "Welcome, Dr. Vance," he said, his voice respectful, making a point to emphasize the title. "My apologies for that woman's behavior." Seraphina offered him a small, genuine smile that transformed her face. "Professional grace under pressure is a rare skill, Leo." "You have it." She picked up her satchel. "Thank you." As she walked down the jet bridge, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The first move had been made. The game was afoot. Carol Weatherby, in her smug certainty, had no idea that she hadn't just insulted a random passenger. She had insulted her company's last best hope, and the price for that insult would be calculated not in dollars, but in corporate decimation. The cabin of the Delta One flight was an oasis of hushed efficiency. Flight attendants moved with quiet purpose, offering pre-departure glasses of champagne and warm towels. Seraphina settled into seat 2A, a lie-flat pod by the window. She accepted a glass of water, bypassing the champagne, and pulled a thick binder filled with scientific papers and market analyses from her satchel. Within minutes, she was completely absorbed, her pen making sharp, precise notes in the margins of a paper on genomic sequencing. Carol Weatherby, seated 3 rows back in 5C, was doing the opposite. She had eagerly accepted the champagne and was already on her second glass. She'd made a loud, self-important phone call to her assistant about synergizing deliverables before takeoff, ensuring everyone around her knew she was a player. She'd seen Seraphina take her seat near the front and had felt a brief, confusing flash of annoyance. How had she managed to get a seat up here? Carol rationalized it away. Probably a last-minute upgrade, a fluke, a system error. It didn't matter. Carol was the real executive on her way to a conference that would define her quarter. Her boss, Mr. Alistair Finch, the formidable CEO of Sterling Archer Holdings, was also on the flight, seated in 1A, the most coveted seat in the cabin. He was a man in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had boarded early and had spoken to no one, immediately immersing himself in the Financial Times. He and Carol were not travelling together in a social sense. They were converging on Aspen for the same purpose, but Alistair Finch did not travel with his subordinates. The purpose was a company codenamed Project Chimera. It was a high-stakes, high-risk, high-reward acquisition. Sterling Archer, a firm built on hostile takeovers of old-world manufacturing and retail, was trying to pivot into the 21st century. They were desperate to get into the biotech space, and they had identified the perfect target, a revolutionary private company called Ethelred Bioventures. Ethelred was the undisputed leader in CRISPR-based gene therapies for rare genetic disorders. Their technology was years ahead of anyone else's, protected by an ironclad fortress of patents. But the company was notoriously private-founded and still run by its enigmatic genius of a CEO, a person known only in the industry by their professional name, Dr. S. Vance. No photos, no splashy interviews, just groundbreaking results and a reputation for fierce independence. Sterling Archer had been trying for months to even get a meeting, and they had finally, through immense effort, secured a preliminary talk at the Aspen Symposium. This deal was Alistair Finch's legacy. For Carol, it was the key to the executive suite. The flight to Aspen was smooth. As the plane began its descent, the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the Rocky Mountains filled the windows. The view was breathtaking, a panorama of raw, majestic power. Carol put her phone away, feeling a surge of adrenaline. This was where the big deals happened. This was her arena. The plane touched down at Aspen Chout-Pitkin County Airport with a gentle bump. As it taxied toward the small exclusive terminal, an announcement came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Aspen. For your convenience, and due to tarmac congestion, we will be parking at a hard stand next to the main terminal. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." Carol groaned. A hard stand. That meant walking down a set of rolling stairs onto the tarmac and into the terminal. It felt so commercial, so public. As the plane maneuvered into its spot, the passengers began to gather their belongings. Carol was already standing, eager to be the first one off. She looked out the window and her eyes widened. Parked on the tarmac, no more than 100 feet away, was a private jet. It wasn't just any private jet. It was a Gulfstream GT650ER, the long-range pinnacle of corporate aviation, a gleaming white spear with elegant dark blue stripes. It was the kind of aircraft that costs upwards of $70 million and whispers of old money and untouchable power. Its engines were spooling down, and a sleek black Cadillac Escalade was parked near its stairway. "Wow," the man next to Carol breathed. "Someone important is in town." Carol nodded, a pang of envy striking her. That was the life. To bypass the terminal, the lines, the indignity of a hard stand. To step from your jet into a waiting car. The plane's door opened, and the deplaning process began. Alistair Finch was first giving a curt nod to the flight attendants. Then the other passengers from the front of the cabin began to file out. And then it was Seraphina's turn. She walked past Carol's row, her expression as placid as it had been in the terminal. She carried her satchel and a slim coat, moving with an unhurried grace that seemed to insulate her from the impatient shuffle of the other passengers. Carol watched her go, a final dismissive thought crossing her mind. Enjoy the walk to the terminal. Alistair Finch was already on the top step of the rolling stairs, his gaze fixed on the magnificent Gulfstream. He was a connoisseur of such things, and he recognized the discreet, stylized A on its tail fin. His brow furrowed. He knew that logo. Where had he seen it? Carol emerged from the plane right behind him, squinting in the bright mountain sunlight. She too stared at the jet. And then she saw something that made her blood run cold. A flight attendant in a crisp tailored uniform had descended from the Gulfstream and was standing at the bottom of its stairs. And walking directly toward that flight attendant across the tarmac was Dr. Seraphina Vance. The Gulfstream's attendant smiled warmly. "Welcome to Aspen, Dr. Vance. The car is ready whenever you are." Seraphina smiled back. "Thank you, Maria. A perfect flight, as always." Carol froze mid-step on the metal stairs. Her mouth went dry. Her mind simply refused to process what her eyes were seeing. The woman from the line. The woman she had called sweetheart. The woman she had tried to banish to the back of the plane. That woman was getting on that plane. Up ahead, Alistair Finch had also stopped. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into his sharp mind. The A on the tail fin. Ethelred Bioventures, and the name the flight attendant had said. Dr. Vance. Dr. S. Vance. His head snapped around his steely eyes, locking onto Carol, who was standing 2 steps below him, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. The color had drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, sickly pallor. He didn't need to say a word. In that single ice-cold glare, Carol understood everything. She understood the magnitude of her mistake. She understood that the woman she had publicly humiliated was not just some random traveler. She was Project Chimera. She was the entire reason they were in Aspen. As Seraphina handed her coat to her attendant and gracefully ascended the stairs to her private jet, Carol felt the solid ground of her ambition crumble into a bottomless abyss. She had picked a fight with a titan armed with nothing but her own petty prejudice, and the consequences were now rolling toward her like an avalanche. The St. Regis Aspen Resort was the unofficial headquarters of the Global Innovators Symposium. Its grand rustic lobby buzzed with the low murmur of immense wealth and influence. Tech billionaires in bespoke hoodies chatted with Nobel laureates in tweed jackets. Venture capitalists huddled in leather armchairs, sketching out billion-dollar deals on cocktail napkins. Carol Weatherby felt none of the usual exhilaration. She felt like a ghost haunting the edges of the event. The image of Seraphina Vance boarding the Gulfstream was seared into her mind. She had checked into her room in a daze, the plush suite feeling less like a reward and more like a holding cell. Every time her phone buzzed, she flinched, expecting a summons from Alistair Finch, a termination notice delivered by email. But for hours there was nothing. Just a terrifying, echoing silence. She couldn't bring herself to go down to the welcome reception. Instead, she stood by the large window of her suite, looking out at the impossibly beautiful mountain landscape. The beauty felt like a mockery. She had spent her entire career clawing her way up the corporate ladder at Sterling Archer. It was a brutal dog-eat-dog environment, and she had thrived on it. She was sharp, she was ruthless, and she knew how to play the game. Or so she had thought. Her fatal error, she realized with a nauseating lurch, was assuming the game was only played by people who looked like her. Her prejudice wasn't just a personal failing. It was a catastrophic professional blind spot. She had profiled Seraphina Vance based on a lazy, toxic stereotype, and in doing so, had armed their biggest target with a weapon that could destroy the most important deal in their company's history. Meanwhile, in the presidential suite, 2 floors above, Alistair Finch was not silent. He was on the phone with his board's chairman, his voice low and tight with fury. "I'm telling you, Martin, it was a disaster," he hissed. "Our SVP of Market Strategy, our point person on the cultural fit assessment for the acquisition." She publicly accosted Dr. Vance at the airport, accused her of being in the wrong line, treated her like a trespasser. There was a pause. Alistair ran a hand over his face. "No, I don't know the exact words. I just saw the aftermath. And I saw Vance getting on her own G650, while Weatherby stood there looking like she'd seen a demon. The A on the tail fin, Martin, Ethelred's logo. It's her." Alistair listened for a long moment, his jaw clenching. "Of course, I haven't fired her yet. I can't. Not until I know the extent of the damage. If I fire her now, it's an admission of guilt before we even get to the table. We have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Right now, Carol Weatherby is a liability I have to somehow contain." He ended the call and slammed the phone down, his composure cracking for a moment. He paced the length of the opulent suite, his mind racing. Ethelred Bioventures was his white whale. The company was projected to be worth $50 billion within a decade. Their flagship therapy AT427 had shown a 95% success rate in clinical trials for treating a debilitating childhood neurological disorder. It was a miracle drug, and Sterling Archer wanted it. They were prepared to offer $12 billion, a staggering sum that would reshape their entire portfolio. But Dr. Vance had been famously reluctant to sell, stating in her rare public communications that the ethos of a partner was more important than the price. And Carol Weatherby had just shown Dr. Vance their ethos. Downstairs, the welcome reception was in full swing. Seraphina Vance made a quiet entrance. She wasn't surrounded by an entourage. She moved through the room with the same understated confidence she'd shown at the airport. But here in this room, people knew who she was. A legendary Silicon Valley investor, a man who had backed 3 of the world's biggest tech companies, broke off his conversation to greet her warmly. The head of the National Institutes of Health engaged her in a deep, animated discussion near the fireplace. She wasn't just another attendee. She was a center of gravity. People orbited her, drawn by the sheer force of her intellect and accomplishments. Carol, having finally worked up the nerve to leave her room, saw this from the doorway. She had intended to find Alistair, to try and explain, to apologize, to beg. But the sight of Seraphina so effortlessly at the heart of this world, Carol so desperately wanted to conquer, stopped her cold. She watched as a man approached Seraphina. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and had an easy, familiar smile. This was Marcus Thorne, the COO of Ethelred Bioventures, and Seraphina's longtime friend and colleague. "Sarah," he said, handing her a glass of sparkling water. "I saw the jet. Smooth landing." "Perfectly," she replied, her voice calm. "We had a bit of minor turbulence at LaGuardia, however." Marcus raised an eyebrow. He knew her tells. That detached, almost clinical tone meant something was wrong. "Turbulence." The weather report was clear. The human climate was less so, Seraphina said, taking a sip of water. She gave him a brief, factual account of the incident in the boarding line. She didn't embellish. She didn't use emotive language. She simply stated what had happened, what was said. Marcus listened, his friendly expression slowly hardening into one of cold fury. "She said what to you?" He knew Seraphina had faced this kind of casual, demeaning prejudice her entire life, from her first day in an advanced physics class to her first pitch in a venture capital boardroom. But knowing it happened didn't make it any less infuriating. "Carol Weatherby," Seraphina said, her eyes scanning the room. "SVP of Market Strategy for Sterling Archer Holdings." Marcus went still. The name of the company hit him like a physical blow. Sterling Archer. The piranhas who have been circling us for a year. The ones we're meeting tomorrow. The very same. Seraphina confirmed, her gaze finally landing on Carol, who was still hovering by the entrance like a frightened moth. Their eyes met across the crowded room. In that moment, Carol saw no anger in Seraphina's expression. She saw something far worse, recognition and assessment. It was the look a scientist gives a specimen under a microscope. Carol's heart hammered against her ribs. She was seen. She was known. There was nowhere to hide. "My God, Sarah," Marcus murmured, his mind reeling with the implications. "This changes everything." "Yes," Seraphina agreed, her voice a soft, dangerous whisper. "It does." She turned her full attention back to Marcus, the rest of the room fading away. The time for quiet endurance was over. The time for strategy had begun. The echo of Carol's words in the airport had now reached the silent, calculating peaks of the business world, and an avalanche was about to be unleashed. The call came at 7:00 a.m. the next morning. Carol's sleep had been a fitful, nightmare-ridden ordeal. The phone on her bedside table buzzed with a sound that felt like an electric shock. The caller ID was blunt, Alistair Finch. Her hand trembled as she answered. "Hello, my sweet." Now was all he said. The line went dead. There was no room for negotiation, no time for preparation. The voice was that of a judge summoning a defendant for sentencing. Carol threw on the first suit she could find, a charcoal grey outfit that suddenly felt like a shroud. She didn't bother with her usual meticulous makeup or hair routine. The artifice of her corporate persona had been shattered. There was no point in trying to glue the pieces back together. She walked the hallway to the presidential suite on legs that felt like they were filled with sand. The entire hotel, the entire world seemed to have gone silent, all sound sucked into the vacuum of her impending doom. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, and it was opened instantly by Finch himself. He was already dressed in a flawless navy suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. He looked as though he had slept a solid 8 hours and woken up ready to conquer nations. His face, however, was a granite mask of controlled rage. He didn't invite her in. He simply turned and walked back into the living area of the suite, leaving her to follow and close the door behind her. The suite was vast, with panoramic windows showcasing the sun rising over the snow-covered peaks. A breakfast cart with silver domes sat untouched. Alistair Finch stood in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, looking less like a CEO and more like a general surveying a battlefield after a devastating loss. "Tell me," he began, his voice dangerously quiet. "What precisely did you say to Dr. Vance?" Carol swallowed. The air was so thin. "Mr. Finch, it was a misunderstanding. I did not ask for an interpretation," he snapped, turning to face her. His eyes were like chips of ice. "I asked for the words, the exact words you used. Verbatim. The demand for precision was a form of torture. He was forcing her to relive her own venom, to speak it into this cold, silent room." Her voice was a hoarse whisper. I suggested she might be in the wrong line. I said the line was for executives." "You said more than that," Finch pressed, taking a step closer. "I spoke to the gate agent this morning, a young man named Leo. Very professional. He remembered you quite clearly, Miss Weatherby. He remembered you called her sweetheart." Carol flinched as if struck. Hearing the word repeated back to her in Finch's icy tone laid bare its full condescending ugliness. And at the end, Finch continued, his voice relentless. "As you were walking away, you said something else." "What was it?" Tears began to well in Carol's eyes, tears of terror and self-pity. I don't remember exactly." "Then allow me to refresh your memory," Finch said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "Have a nice flight. In the back." "Is that not what you said?" Carol could only nod, a choked sob escaping her throat. Alistair Finch stared at her for a long, brutal moment, letting her confession hang in the air. The silence stretched, filled only by Carol's ragged breathing. For 6 months, he began his voice a low, seething lecture. My team has been working 18-hour days to get this meeting. We have spent millions on due diligence, on legal prep, on consultancy fees. We are here to make a $12 billion offer for a company that will secure the future of Sterling Archer for the next 50 years. It is the single most important transaction of my career, of this company's existence. He took another step. He was towering over her now. And you, he said, his voice laced with a contempt so profound it was almost physical. You decided to risk all of it. For what? For the momentary thrill of putting a black woman in what you perceived to be her place. Did it make you feel powerful, Carol, to play gatekeeper at the airport? No. I didn't know who she was. Carol finally cried out the defense she had been clinging to. That is the entire point. Finch roared, his control finally breaking. The sound echoed off the high ceilings. It should not matter who she is. Your behavior was not just unprofessional, it was bigoted. It revealed a rot in your character. And because of who she is, that rot in your character may very well have infected this entire company with a terminal illness. The one thing Vance has ever said publicly about a sale is that the ethos of a partner is paramount. And you, our senior vice president of market strategy, showed her our ethos. You gift-wrapped it for her in a neat little package of smug, casual racism. He turned away from her, pacing back to the window. He was breathing heavily, trying to regain his composure. Our meeting is at 2 o'clock this afternoon, he said, his back still to her. It has not been cancelled. I find that more terrifying than if it had been. A cancellation would be a clean death. This feels like she's sharpening the knife. He turned back around. You will be at that meeting. Carol looked up, a flicker of hope in her eyes. I will. Thank you, Mr. Finch. I will make it right. I promise. Do not misunderstand me, he cut her off coldly. You are not coming to negotiate. You are not coming to speak. You are coming as a prop. You will sit there, and you will be a living, breathing symbol of the problem we have. You will listen to whatever Dr. Vance has to say, and you will absorb it. Your presence will be my non-verbal admission that I know what you did. It is the only card I have left to play immediate and visible contrition. The tiny flicker of hope in Carol's eyes died, replaced by a deep, hollow understanding. She wasn't being given a second chance. She was being used as a tool of surrender. Her humiliation was now a corporate strategy. After the meeting, Finch concluded, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. You will tender your resignation. It will be effective immediately. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement, so comprehensive that you will not be able to so much as mention the name Sterling Archer to your dog. Your severance will be the bare minimum required by law. Your career in this industry, for all intents and purposes, is over. Is that clear, Carol Weatherby, SVP of Market Strategy, a woman who, 24 hours ago, had believed she was on top of the world, stood in the most expensive suite in Aspen, and saw the complete and utter demolition of her life? She nodded, the tears now flowing freely down her face. Yes, Mr. Finch, she whispered. It's clear. While Carol was facing her professional demise, Seraphina Vance was having breakfast on the sun-drenched terrace of her own suite. Across from her sat Marcus Thorne, her COO. The remains of a light meal sat between them, but their focus was on the tablet in Seraphina's hands, which displayed the Sterling Archer acquisition proposal. It had been sent over late last night, a massive document filled with financial projections, legal jargon, and corporate synergies. Marcus was still simmering with a protective rage. We should just cancel, he said, his voice tight. Send them a one-line email. Due to a fundamental misalignment of corporate ethos, we are no longer considering your offer. Let Finch and that woman fly back to New York and explain to their board how they fumbled a $12 billion deal because of cheap bigotry. Seraphina listened, her gaze, distant, fixed on the peak of a mountain. She understood his anger. She felt a version of it herself, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. It was a familiar feeling, the exhaustion of having to constantly be twice as good, twice as composed, just to be considered equal. The incident with Carol wasn't a singular event. It was a symptom of a disease she had been fighting her entire life. An emotional response would be satisfying, she said finally, her voice measured. But it would be a disservice to what we've built. A disservice, Marcus countered, leaning forward. Sarah, they insulted you, the founder, the heart, the brain of this company. There is no partnership without respect. Period. I agree, she said, meeting his gaze. But respect isn't just about feelings, Marcus. It's about power. It's about control. They have shown us their greatest weakness before we even stepped into the negotiating room. She tapped the tablet. Sterling Archer is a dinosaur. They buy companies, strip them for parts, and lay off the staff to maximize shareholder value. Look at their portfolio: dying retail chains, outdated manufacturing plants. They are bleeding, and they know it. They need us far more than we need them. Ethelred isn't just another asset to them. It's a lifeline. It's their ticket to relevance to the future. Marcus began to see her logic. So they're desperate, precisely, Seraphina said. And desperate people make mistakes. Carol Weatherby was their first mistake. Now they are terrified. Alistair Finch is an intelligent man. He knows exactly how catastrophic this is. If we walk away now, he loses the deal. But if we go to that meeting... A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen since she'd told him the story. It was a smile of formidable intelligence and strategic brilliance. If we go to that meeting, she continued, we don't just have the leverage of our technology, our patents, and our market position. We have the moral leverage. We have the leverage of their own appalling behavior. We can rewrite the entire terms of this deal. This was the world Seraphina Vance truly inhabited. The boardroom, not the boarding line, was her battlefield. Her mind, not her anger, was her weapon. She had spent a lifetime channeling the slights and obstacles she faced into fuel. This would be no different. This insult would not just be endured, it would be monetized. It would be transformed into a tool for change. What are you thinking? Marcus asked, now completely aligned with her, his anger replaced by a thrill of anticipation. I'm thinking their $12 billion offer is a starting point, and not a very good one, she began. I'm thinking the cash component needs to increase by 20%. I'm thinking the stock options need a more favorable vesting schedule for our employees. She paused, taking a sip of tea. And I'm thinking about the ethos. Mr. Finch wants to buy our science. Fine. But if he wants it, he has to buy our values too. He has to prove he's serious about a culture that would never have allowed a Carol Weatherby to feel so comfortable in her prejudice. She looked at Marcus, her eyes shining with fierce resolve. I want a mandatory top-to-bottom diversity, equity, and inclusion overhaul of Sterling Archer Holdings, she declared. Not some internal HR memo. I want it conducted by an independent external firm, a firm of my choosing. I want a 5-year, $100 million fund established to support STEM education and venture capital for underrepresented founders. That fund will be a non-negotiable condition of the sale. We will write it into the acquisition contract. They won't just buy Ethelred. They will pay to begin the process of inoculating themselves against the very poison that Carol Weatherby represents. Marcus stared at her, stunned into silence for a moment, before a wide grin broke across his face. It was brilliant. It was audacious. It wasn't revenge. It was restorative justice, executed at a corporate level with surgical precision. It was turning a moment of personal humiliation into a structural legacy. "They will never agree to it," Marcus said, though his tone was one of admiration, not doubt. "Oh, they will," Seraphina said calmly, "because Alistair Finch wants his legacy, and right now the only person who can give it to him is the woman his senior vice president tried to kick out of the boarding line." She closed the tablet. "Now let's prepare for our meeting. We have a company to sell, and another company to rebuild." She stood up and looked out at the mountains, at the vast, clear blue sky. She had taken the ugliness of that moment in the airport and was about to transform it into something powerful and lasting. Carol Weatherby had wanted to put her in her place. Seraphina Vance was about to show her and Alistair Finch what her place truly was at the head of the table, setting the terms for their surrender. The meeting was held in a neutral space, a private conference room at the St. Regis with a heavy oak table and a commanding view of the mountains. The air was thick with tension. Alistair Finch and Carol Weatherby were there first. Alistair stood by the window, a statue of grim composure. Carol sat at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was pale and silent, her eyes fixed on the polished surface of the wood. She looked smaller, diminished the arrogant armor of her former self, stripped away completely. She was, as Finch had intended, a living apology. At precisely 2:00 p.m. the door opened. Dr. Seraphina Vance and Marcus Thorne entered. Seraphina was wearing a simple but immaculately tailored navy blue dress. She carried a single leather-bound portfolio. She exuded an aura of such profound and quiet control that the entire atmosphere in the room shifted, bending toward her. "Mr. Finch," she said, her tone professional and cool. She nodded once at him, her eyes flicking briefly dispassionately toward Carol before dismissing her. The glance was not one of anger or triumph. It was the glance one might give a piece of furniture. It was a complete and total erasure of significance. In that moment, Carol understood she had become irrelevant. "Dr. Vance, Mr. Thorne, Alistair," said, his voice strained. "Thank you for coming. Please." He gestured to the chairs. They all took their seats, Seraphina and Marcus on one side of the vast table, Alistair and Carol on the other. The gulf between them felt miles wide. Alistair began clearing his throat. "Dr. Vance, before we discuss the proposal, I feel it is incumbent upon me to address the regrettable incident that occurred at the airport yesterday. The behavior of my employee was inexcusable, unprofessional, and doesn't reflect the values of Sterling Archer Holdings." He paused, looking at Seraphina, hoping for some kind of acknowledgement, a nod, anything. He received nothing. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. It was an isolated incident, an appalling lapse in judgment from a single individual. He continued, the desperation beginning to seep into his voice. "And I want to assure you that it has been dealt with internally. Severely." He glanced at Carol, whose head sank even lower. Seraphina let the silence stretch after he finished. She leaned forward slightly, placing her portfolio on the table, but didn't open it. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice calm and cutting. "Let's not begin our first potential partnership with a fiction. It was not an isolated incident. An act like that is not a lapse in judgment. It is a revelation of character. And it is not the action of a single individual. It is the symptom of a corporate culture that allows such a character to be promoted to the rank of senior vice president." Alistair flinched. She had gone straight for the heart of the matter, bypassing his carefully constructed corporate apology. Your employee, Seraphina, continued still not looking at. Carol felt perfectly comfortable in a public space, appointing herself the arbiter of who belongs in a line for executives. Her assessment was based on a visual profile, on race. She did this loudly and without fear of repercussion. That tells me everything I need to know about the environment you've cultivated at Sterling Archer. It's an environment where someone like her can feel secure in her prejudice. So no, Mr. Finch, it is not an isolated incident. It is a data point, and it is the single most important piece of due diligence I have conducted on your firm. The room was utterly silent. Carol looked like she might physically faint. Alistair had gone pale. He had come prepared for a negotiation about money. He had not come prepared for a vivisection of his company's soul. Marcus Thorne then spoke for the first time. "As such," he said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table, "our counter-proposal is structured in two parts. Part 1 is financial. Part 2 is remedial." Alistair picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the first section, and his sharp intake of breath was audible. The purchase price had been increased to $15 billion. The employee stock options were now non-negotiable. The legal indemnities had been shifted almost entirely to Sterling Archer. It was a brutal, punishing financial revision. But it was the second part that made his blood run cold. He read the terms aloud, his voice hollow. A mandatory externally audited, diversity, equity, and inclusion restructuring of Sterling Archer Holdings and all its subsidiaries to be conducted by the Callaway Group. He looked up. The Callaway Group was the most rigorous, most expensive, and most feared DEI consultancy in the world. They were famous for their unsparing, data-driven reports that had led to the firing of entire executive boards. At Sterling Archer's sole expense, he continued reading, a binding 5-year commitment to establish a $100 million charitable fund, the Ethelred Initiative, to promote STEM programs and provide venture capital for underrepresented entrepreneurs. The fund's board will be appointed by Dr. Vance. He dropped the paper on the table. He stared at Seraphina, a look of utter disbelief on his face. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a surrender treaty. She wasn't just selling her company. She was forcing him to pay for the privilege of being remade in her image. She was demanding he use his own money to publicly and systematically dismantle the very culture that had allowed Carol to thrive. "This is unprecedented," he stammered. "The circumstances are unprecedented," Seraphina replied coolly. "You want to buy the future, Mr. Finch. My company is the future. And the future is not built on the kind of thinking that was on display at LaGuardia yesterday. The price of admission to that future is a commitment to leave the past behind. These are our terms. They are not negotiable." She stood up. Marcus stood with her. "You have our proposal," she said. "We are scheduled to fly back to New York tomorrow evening. You can deliver your answer before then." She looked at Alistair Finch, a titan of industry, now reduced to a man trapped between his legacy and his pride. Then, for the first and only time, her gaze settled on Carol Weatherby. "And Ms. Weatherby," she said, her voice devoid of heat but heavy with finality. "A word of advice. True executive presence has nothing to do with which line you stand in. It has to do with the character you show while you're standing there. You should work on that." With that, she and Marcus turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than any amount of shouting could ever be. They left behind the single sheet of paper that held the fate of Sterling Archer Holdings, a testament not to a deal, but to a reckoning. The hard karma had arrived, not as a flash of lightning, but as a contractual obligation. Alistair Finch didn't sleep that night. He sat in his suite, the single sheet of paper from Seraphina Vance on the table in front of him, illuminated by a single lamp. It was a declaration of war and a blueprint for peace all in one. His pride, the pride of a man who had built an empire through hostile takeovers and ruthless efficiency, screamed at him to tear it up, to walk away, to let Ethelred go and find another target. But his intellect, the cold, calculating part of him that had made him a billionaire, knew that was impossible. There was no other Ethelred. Dr. Vance was right. They were the future. Without them, Sterling Archer was a relic. The financial terms were brutal, but survivable. It was the other part, the remedial part, that was the true blow. It was a public shaming, a forced confession written into the ledger books that his company was fundamentally broken. The Callaway Group would be like auditors of the soul, digging into every hiring practice, every promotion, every unconscious bias. It would be painful, expensive, and humiliating. But it would also work. He knew it would. It would make his company better, stronger, more resilient. It would inoculate them against the kind of catastrophic blind spot that Carol Weatherby had personified. Seraphina Vance wasn't just punishing them. She was offering them a cure for their disease, and simply asking them to pay for the medicine. At 4:00 a.m., surrounded by the silent mountains, he made his decision. He picked up the phone and called his lead counsel. "Draw up the acceptance," he said, his voice weary but resolute. "Every term, exactly as written." The next afternoon, just as Seraphina and Marcus were preparing to leave for the airport, a courier delivered a heavy binder to their suite. It was the revised acquisition agreement. Marcus opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. He looked up at Seraphina, a slow, amazed smile spreading across his face. "He signed it," Marcus said, almost in disbelief. Every last word. The price, the fund, the Callaway Group, all of it. Seraphina felt not a surge of triumph, but a quiet, profound sense of rightness. The arc of the moral universe had been bent ever so slightly toward justice, using the levers of capital and consequence. Their journey back was the reverse of their arrival. They were driven across the tarmac in a black Escalade to the gleaming Gulfstream G650ER. As Seraphina settled into her plush leather seat, she looked out the window and saw the commercial Delta flight to JFK, the same flight Alistair Finch would be on boarding at the main terminal. It was a small, symbolic inversion of the scene at LaGuardia. What happened next became the stuff of quiet Wall Street legend. The acquisition of Ethelred Bioventures by Sterling Archer Holdings for $15 billion was announced 2 weeks later. The financial press was stunned by the price. But the real shock came when the secondary clauses of the deal were made public, as Seraphina had insisted they be. The mandated DEI overhaul by the Callaway Group and the establishment of the $100 million Ethelred initiative sent shock waves through the corporate world. It set a new, impossibly high bar for corporate responsibility in M&A deals. Alistair Finch was initially seen as weak, but as the months went by and Sterling Archer's stock began to climb, buoyed by the potential of Ethelred's pipeline, the narrative shifted. He was hailed as a visionary, a man who understood that in the 21st century, a company's culture was as valuable as its technology. He had saved his legacy, but only by surrendering his pride. And Carol Weatherby. Her resignation was accepted the day she returned to New York. The comprehensive NDA she signed ensured she would never work in high-level finance again. She became a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. Her name was synonymous with career suicide. She had lost everything, not because of a single bad day, but because a single bad day had revealed who she truly was. She moved to a small town in the Midwest, selling real estate, forever haunted by the echo of her own voice, saying, "This line's for executives only." Dr. Seraphina Vance took her seat on the new board of the combined company. She never spoke of the incident at LaGuardia again. She didn't need to. The terms of the deal spoke for her. She continued her work, pushing the boundaries of science now, with the vast resources of Sterling Archer at her command. The Ethelred initiative she controlled began funding brilliant young minds from backgrounds just like her own, building a new generation of innovators who would never have to justify their presence in a room or a line. Her victory wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, structural, and permanent. It was the kind of karma that doesn't just strike back. It rebuilds the world to be a little bit better, a little bit fairer. She proved that the ultimate power isn't getting on the private jet. It's having the wisdom, the grace, and the strength to leverage a moment of disrespect into a legacy of change. And that's how a single racist comment didn't just backfire, it triggered a multi-billion-dollar corporate reckoning. This wasn't just about a private jet. That was only the symbol of the power Carol Weatherby failed to recognize. The real story is about how Dr. Seraphina Vance used quiet dignity and strategic genius, not for petty revenge, but for systemic change. She didn't just get an apology. She forced an entire company to buy a conscience. She turned an insult into $100 million initiative to lift others up. That is the definition of hard karma. If you believe in the power of quiet strength, and that our actions, no matter how small, have consequences, then do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to see proof that character is the ultimate currency. And of course, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story of justice being served. What do you think of Seraphina's final move? Was it brilliant or too merciful? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.